think he was rolling the pitch for a tactical retreat. The stuff about being in a listening mood, looking for solutions. If I were him, that's precisely what I would be doing. He's got into a terrible mess, and he needs to find a way out of it quickly.
What have you made of Tim Davies' response there to what's been going on with Gary Lineker?
Well, I detected, to use a sporting metaphor, I think he was rolling the pitch for a tactical retreat. The stuff about being in a listening mood, looking for solutions. If I were him, that's precisely what I would be doing. He's got into a terrible mess, and he needs to find a way out of it quickly.
Do you see the BBC's issue? It was Rob Powell from Sky News who was looking into an outcome of an investigation of another tweet by Gary Lineker. This had to do with in 2022. And the investigation found that there are individuals who are so closely associated with the BBC, such as Gary Lineker, that even though he's not in journalism or news gathering strictly, he's such a big figure and such a strong association with the BBC that impartiality becomes a bit of an issue.
Well, I think that's how the BBC's got into this mess. Listen, I'm a complete supporter of impartiality in news and current affairs. It's the lifeblood of the BBC, and it's essential. But the BBC is a huge organization that does everything from baking through to music, from tiddlywinks through to, I don't know what, horse racing. And the thought that every producer, every presenter of all these programs is going to be policed for anything they say, I think becomes impossible. If you are going to police it, then you have to police it equally, and you have to police Alan Sugar, and you have to police Prue Leith, you have to police Andrew Neil. I mean, where does it stop? There's a very helpful list in The Observer today of all the people who present programs who have said things that appear to break the guidelines. So I think where the BBC's got into trouble is by appearing to single out Lineker for things that he said were disobliging about the current government. And either you police everyone equally, or you reach a more sensible set of rules that can actually be enforced.
But they would probably come back and say something along the lines of, when you look at Gary Lineker, you think BBC, because he's such a big figure for the BBC, particularly for sports, whereas Lord Sugar, not quite so much, even though he is the centrepiece of The Apprentice, but it's just The Apprentice. All those other names that we mentioned, again, you don't see them and think immediately that's a representative of the BBC. Can you understand why Gary Lineker perhaps may make a special case?
Well, there are two different considerations. One is the tactical one. If you're going to go down the route that you go down, who was wargaming that with Tim Davie, the Director General? Could they not have seen that this might lead to a walkout from other stars, and that they would be reduced to the ridiculous situation of having Match of the Day silenced and Radio 5 silenced? So unless that's what they wanted, I can't believe that they did, then tactically they haven't played this very well. Editorially, why are those rules in place? They're so that we can trust the BBC's news and current affairs output. Are people so stupid that they think that somebody who presents a show on Saturday night talking about football is going to imperil that if Gary Lineker can't be trusted, then we can't trust Nick Robinson, or we can't trust Laura Kunsberg, or we can't trust Chris Mason? I don't believe there's a single person in the country that would think that. So I think if I were Tim Davie today, I would be reaching for a wise person who could rapidly come up with a more nuanced set of rules that is not going to get the BBC into this terrible mess again.
Alan, do you think that the problem is goes up the chain and becomes bigger? I'm talking, of course, about Richard Sharp, Tim Davie himself, Sir Robbie Gibb, I should say, all very closely associated with the Conservative Party. The appointment of the BBC chairman is a political appointment. It's happened from previous governments as well. Is it time, perhaps, to rethink how the BBC Board of Governors is assembled to try and take the politics out of it?
Yes, I completely agree with that. In fact, I would go further. And if whoever's going to be the next government, let's pretend it's going to be a Labour government, I would have thought the best favour they could do to the BBC would be to completely remove it from any scent of political control. That wouldn't be hard to do. But at the moment, we've got a situation. I mean, what was really wrong with Richard Sharp's appointment was that Boris Johnson let it be known that he wanted his candidate to be chair of the BBC. He wanted Charles Moore, the former editor of the Daily Telegraph. Now, by letting that be known, he instantly deterred anyone of any caliber from applying for the job. I know that because I spoke to quite a few people who, in normal circumstances, would have made excellent chairs of the BBC. He couldn't get his way with Charles Moore, so he then wangled Richard Sharp, and we know that was a very problematic appointment because Richard Sharp was a massive Tory donor and also was trying to arrange a loan for Boris Johnson, which he didn't declare. So the whole process of Richard Sharp's appointment was tainted. And we can go back to the Hutton affair, the various battles that the BBC has had with successive governments. And I just think that's terrible for the BBC, and that it would be a really good thing for the next government to completely ring fence the BBC. It's a great national asset. It's a great international asset, and it shouldn't be damaged by these unseemly rows.
Before we go, Alan, do you think there is a way to solve this problem? You talked about Tim Davie sort of rolling the pitch for perhaps a stepping back from the BBC. He has spoken about how he wants to see Gary Lineker back on Match of the Day. Do you think that's possible? You've got 36 Conservative MPs who wrote to the BBC asking for an investigation. We know that Gary Lineker is not going to apologise for the tweets he put out. Can those two things be reconciled?
Well, let's set aside the 36 Tory MPs because they shouldn't count if the BBC is going to be independent, and 36 isn't that many. I think the way to do it is to find a highly respected figure, perhaps one of the people who could have been in the running to be Director General, somebody with knowledge of the broadcasting industry, but is viewed as completely independent. And say, look, can you look at these guidelines and review them in order to avoid these kinds of unwinnable clashes in future? And funnily enough, I think the guidelines were more flexible in the past. I think they did allow carve-outs. The versions I've seen floating around at one point said, it more or less had a Gary Lineker carve-out. It said, for instance, it's a lesser offence if somebody who is commentating on sport says something about politics. Now, I think if one could go back to that kind of flexibility, which treats us, the viewers, as grown-ups, as I say, I can't think of anybody who's going to think that Gary Lineker's views on asylum is going to taint the way that we watch the BBC News and current affairs programs. Then I think Lineker could be back, and we could be out of this really damaging situation.